Hey, this is Garrett Fry. I wanted to do a quick demo on how to set up a 3D grid for your perspective, a 3D setup. So you have a couple of options when you take on these VFX Horde shots to find your perspective. And perspective is really, really important because it is the thing that holds everything together. You can have beautiful lighting and color and integration, but if your perspective is off, then there's nothing, it will always look wrong. There's nothing you can do to make it look better if the perspective is wrong. So that is why perspective is so important. So I'm going to show you how to set up a grid within 3D. You could take it into Photoshop. You could draw your perspective lines and find your horizon line. That's a totally legit way of doing it. But when you're looking at a shot like this for the shipyard, and you have these specific shapes of these shipping containers, and you want to know the scale of those shipping containers as they go back into space, because for this particular shot, the shot brief is to take out these shipping containers and add depth to this shipping yard. So to do that, we're going to need to see what the scale of these objects are as they go back into space. So the first thing that I've done here is I've loaded the image sequence into the image plane of the camera. So I've loaded the shot camera here into the image plane, and if you go over here into the view of the shot camera and click on import, you can load your image sequence there, and then you can say use image sequence. So that will make it so that when you're scrubbing your playhead, you get to see the film footage moving as the camera is moving, which is pretty cool. Also, just remember to set your frame range to start at 1001, because that is that's the first frame of all of these sequences is 1001. So after you have that set up, the thing that you can do here is just create a cube. So let's go ahead and do that here. So there is a cube right there. I'm going to look at this in through our shot camera, and I'm just gonna place a cube here. Okay. So I'm roughly going to set up the shape of this. So I know that the shipping container is approximately going to be somewhere around there. So that's about the size of this guy. And that's what we're going to line up to. We're going to line up this cube to this space right here. And this is, so I'm going to take this camera, I'm going to group it, and then I'm going to move the pivot point of this camera over here to this cube. So if I press insert and move this guy over here, I'm going to press V. As you can see up here, it's going to lock it to the vertice, so I can just snap it to the bottom of that. Okay, so now that I've moved the pivot point, now my camera is rotating around the corner of this box right here. Okay, so this is not the typical practice of things to move the camera to accommodate the cube here, but it's a good way to go if like for this, there's not really any parallax. Doesn't matter if you move the camera, you're not having a 3D scene that you have to, you're just doing still renders for this, or you're doing a 3D lineup, so you're not concerned about keep maintaining the integrity of the camera. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn this over here, and if it helps here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this on X-ray. And then I'm going to set this to wireframe on shaded. So now I can see this. I can tell that this guy needs to be quite a bit bigger. I'm going to move the pivot point down again, press Insert or Home on a Mac, and V is going to snap it to the bottom there, and I'm just going to scale it up. Okay, so I'll go back here, go back to the top level, and I'm going to just move this guy over. I think our cube is not quite in the right spot there. So I'm going to just adjust this pivot point right there in the corner. So there we go. Let's scale up this cube again, and we can see that our dimensions actually that we guessed at are pretty darn close. So let's scale this down here to be about there. All right, so now that we've created one of these boxes here, we can kind of test to make sure that it's looking good by moving this box back into space here, and then checking our distance and our perspective. And I actually think that these, it looks like maybe the second row is just a little bit turned. So if I turn that cube a little bit, because they don't look like they're exactly on the same, positioned exactly the same. But when I turn it like that, it seems to work out great. I'm going to duplicate this, and then the next test would be to follow this back into space here. And I can see that actually we're a little bit off, because the bottom of this should hit the bottom of this shipping container back there. So I'm going to readjust, walk up to the highest level of my camera, and then I'm just going to maybe just tilt this guy down a little bit. So right there. So that's much better. And this guy we can move back just a little bit more. Okay. So there we go. So let's make this guy a bit longer right there. All right. So we have the relative size of these smaller shipping containers here, and we have the size of the larger shipping containers here. So now we've established scale in our 3D scene. And so now what we would do is we could duplicate these back here in our scene, and then I could start stacking these guys. And you can kind of get a sense now for the scale of these shipping containers as they go back into space. So if I'm going to make stacks of these, that's what it's going to look like as it goes back in space here. Let's move these forward right there. So yeah, so if we look at that with the tracked the footage here, we can see it's sticking nicely. This is the scale of these smaller shipping containers, and everything works out great. So at this point, if you're developing a concept, you could render out these cubes, pick your projection frame, whatever that projection frame is. For this shot, it would be the last frame because you're replacing this. So you would pick the last frame, and that would be your projection frame. You would render out these cubes, and you would bring it into this image in Photoshop. You'd have the last frame and this render, and so you have this guide for the scale. And then you would put in your concept based on this scale. So you'd fill up this area with your shipping containers. And then what you would do is instead of the image sequence back here, you would actually put your matte painting concept in this spot. and then you would move all of these to match your concept, and just to make sure and double check that you've got the right kind of scale. So you can, this setup can help you in two ways. One, to give you an initial idea of the scale and perspective of these shipping containers. And then two, after you're done with the concept, bring your concept back in and then double check all of your work by moving these little cubes to the spots that you have shipping containers in your concept, just to make sure that the scale and perspective is right for everything. So this will work. This, is great for the shipyard sequence, but it'll work for the cityscape or, anything else that perspective is important for, which is really any of the VFX Horde sequences that you're doing DMP stuff for. Perspective is absolutely crucial to a successful DMP shot. So this is just one way to figure out your perspective.